what our values are within the department align with the purpose and mission of the Student Basic Needs Action Network. The goal of this network, as I have read, is to identify opportunities to increase access to public benefits and basic needs and services for students, with the focus on students of color, students with low incomes, students in rural areas, and adult learners. The network and its goals and purposes, again, align so nicely within the work that we are doing within DCBS. I'm particularly excited to be with you today as we discuss the policy scan completed to help identify additional ways that DCBS can decrease barriers through changes in our policies to improve access to services that we provide for students. Within the department, we are focused on building a 21st century DCBS to modernize all levels of our agency and its services. We are working diligently to move our services upstream with an increased focus on primary and secondary prevention efforts, and the work of this network will aid us in that effort. Within DCBS, we are emphasizing to staff the importance of economic and concrete supports, such as SNAP, Medicaid, KTAB, and child care, and highlighting their role in prevention. By decreasing barriers and increasing access to these services within DCBS, we are helping all citizens within the Commonwealth, including students, to reach their full human potential. We've seen during the pandemic that by increasing access to these services resulted in positive outcomes for individuals and families. During that time, there were a number of studies conducted that showed the impact of SNAP and other economic and concrete supports, and demonstrated how these resources yielded positive outcomes and decreased child maltreatment. We also know the role of education in helping us build a strong economic future. Students, or anyone for that matter, should not have to worry about how they are going to get their basic needs met, such as food, childcare, and housing. They should be focusing on attending classes and achieving academic success, regardless of their background or their economic status. This type of focus and attention is so important as we all work together to help students to be able to continue their educational goals and achieve credentials that will help them and their family in the future, building stronger communities and building a stronger Kentucky. I am so appreciative of this work and for the opportunity to partner with this network as we work together to support students in their pursuit of higher education and improve outcomes. So again, thank you for allowing me to be here and speak to you today. And I look forward to the policy scan today and learning again more about how we can decrease barriers to the services that we provide within DCBS and better serve students.
Thank you, Commissioner Dennis. Greatly appreciate that. One of the most important things I think of an action network is like recognizing the interconnectedness of all of our unique organizations and institutions, and how we can definitely do more together when we have a common goal and we're trying to align our work. So really excited to have you and your voice here with us.
Thank you. Okay. Glad to be here.
I'm going to move forward. And so now I'm going to turn it over to our partner, Carrie Welton. She is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy, focused on anti-poverty and basic needs with the Institute for College Access and Success. Carrie has been working with the collaborative on our basic needs work this entire year, and she has been an incredible resource and just has a variety of state perspectives to draw on to help us, you know, with our own context here in Kentucky, find the solutions that are going to help us maximize our impact. So I'm going to turn it over to Carrie. I will stop sharing and let you share your own screen.
Thanks very much, Lily. 1 second, let me get that up. Okay, can you see the slides? Okay, wonderful, thank you. Hey everybody, great to be back with you. And I want to thank Acting Commissioner Dennis for her leadership. I've been doing state technical assistance for many years now, and I recognize as an outside person coming into a state and poking around in people's statutes and regs may not always feel like a positive approach, but Commissioner Dennis has exhibited such leadership and grace and openness and curiosity to what policies other states are leveraging and what are available under federal statute to benefit Kentucky. So I really just want to thank her and recognize her leadership in this space. So really quickly, we will go through, Lily, I probably don't need to do the background on the policy scan, but I'm just going to show where it sort of sits in the rest of the project. And then we were fortunate enough to have a conversation with Commissioner Dennis and members of her team yesterday that provided some really great feedback on these initial policy recommendations. So what you'll be viewing in these next couple of slides is a summary of them, because we have some great feedback we're going to adapt for the final policy scan. So again, thanks to the Commissioner and her team for their support and partnership. And then we'll talk about what are opportunities for program alignment. So when we think about making policy change, you have to think about beyond the policy change, what does it mean to vertically integrate that change so it actually reaches the people at the end of the programs that we really care about? And then what are some expanded opportunities that we think about, whether they're through state agency action or state leadership, or even potentially legislative? I haven't parsed out which opportunities I would potentially pursue that were legislative or state opportunity, because the state has demonstrated such leadership that, you know, in instances where you feel like you don't have another choice, legislation is a great opportunity. But in this case, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to find ways, paths forward together. So as Lily mentioned, is we'll hear from other members of the Action Network today. The policy scan sits within the Greater Student Basic Needs Project. And this is really thinking about the ecosystem of systems and policies that affect students' access. And not only student access, but what we really focus on is ensuring that people who are engaging with public programs have access to education. So it's both about ensuring students have access to the supports while they're enrolled, and that people who are receiving supports have access to post-secondary credentials so Kentucky can reach their goals and achieve economic security for Kentuckians. So the first program, and we did a sort of basic needs overview in a prior session, but I'll just remind people of each one of the programs' sort of functionality and then talk about the recommendations. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, provides a modest electronic benefit on a card for recipients to ensure they can meet their most basic need for food. That's dependent on income and family size. SNAP already has stringent income criteria, household criteria, and citizenship criteria that everyone must meet. And then within that, there are additional restrictions on student eligibility. One of those restrictions is a student must be working on average 20 hours a week. Those hours can be averaged over a month or over an academic period. And that's one opportunity we identified, is that Kentucky has the opportunity to average those work hours over a longer period, which smooths sort of income volatility effects. And then there are opportunities to expand programs that confer eligibility to include all programs at KCTCS institutions. At present, Kentucky does recognize a large number of career and technical programs that confer student eligibility, but there is a potentially broader interpretation if it fits, you know, both the states and the Action Network's goals. And then some states are leveraging an opportunity for students to self-attest to how their program leads to employability. This is one of the, when you think about how the federal government defines education and training programs, the full scope of that is education and training programs that lead to employability. And some states are leveraging an option that allows students themselves to describe how that leads to employability as opposed to tying it to a single program. There are also federal and state funding opportunities for institutions to leverage SNAP outreach dollars, and that education outreach can share information about SNAP, can connect students to SNAP, and ensure that they are aware that that's a program that they can apply for. And those are just a couple of options under the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So SNAP's Employment and Training Program confers additional resources to people who are eligible for the Employment and Training Program. SNAP ENT sort of sits under the larger umbrella of SNAP. I sort of think about there's SNAP eligibility, and then there's SNAP student eligibility, and there's SNAP employment and training, and they kind of sit in a Venn diagram. But essentially what happens is when somebody applies for SNAP, they are deemed eligible, they are assessed for employment and training services. And if they are deemed eligible for employment and training services, they are then referred to an ENT provider. There are currently several providers in the state, including Goodwill Industries, Kentuckiana Works, and our recommendation is that KCTCS as a system identify what resources and technical assistance and training would be needed to become a full SNAP ENT provider in the same way that those other organizations are, fully recognizing that there would need to be a working group or convening some sort of body to understand what does that fully mean for KCTCS institutions and ensuring that they're properly resourced and trained to be able to deliver those services. And there will be time for questions at the end, but again, you know I like to keep this conversational, so please feel free to keep putting questions in the chat box. Lily will help monitor it or even come off mic and ask question as needed. The Child Care Assistance Program, or CCAP as it's called in Kentucky, is a child care subsidy program. It is a block grant to states similar to KTAP or the TANF program, so states receive a set amount of funding. Unfortunately, the federal government does not fully fund all of the child care that is needed in a state or federally, so there are typically not enough resources to go around. That's not within your state's control. There needs to be more federal funding for child care so people can work and attend school. But within that program, there are several opportunities to maximize flexibility to ensure that people who are receiving child care subsidies can access post-secondary education without restrictions and without barriers. So making sure that people who are enrolled in post-secondary education can work while they're attending classes is really beneficial, that they can combine the two, because we know that most people who are eligible for a program like CCAP have a very low income and are usually going to have to work regardless to support their family. Being a full-time student alone is actually really not all that practical for some of the students with lowest incomes that we care about. And then some states leverage an option to ensure that each credit hour a student is enrolled in of either online or in-person coursework is doubled to account for an hour needed of travel time or study time or other things that we know go into the need for a student to be successful, accounting for all of the work that goes into a credit hour. I don't know what it was. I think it was, I think I was told when I was an undergrad that like for every credit hour you should plan for like 3 hours of homework a week or something like that. I'm not going to say whether or not I actually did that, but there's some sort of guidelines around how that should be approached. And then in the KTAP, Kentucky Transitional Assistance Program, federally that program is referred to as TANF. That's the Cash Assistance Program. It is traditionally what we think of as welfare. One of the recommendations coming into this was to sort of expand the KTAP eligible population, so people in Kentucky who need additional resources are able to access those resources, and then to identify ways to strengthen the already successful Ready to Work program and better leverage state funding. I will just say, in addition to opportunities, Kentucky is doing a lot of things really well. One of the first recommendations that I make when coming into a state is to raise the gross income limit. What that really means is that the federal limit for a program like SNAP is set at 130% of the federal poverty level. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but for a 3-person family, I think that's around like $36,000 a year. But raising a gross income limit up to 200% of the federal poverty level allows that same 3-person family to maintain their benefit eligibility all the way up to, I think it's about $47,000 a year. Please don't quote me on this. I don't have these numbers in front of me. I think they're in the last slide that I presented to you all. But the reason that's so beneficial is because as a person is growing in their income through their job, their benefit amount slowly decreases, which provides a better transition off of benefits. So I don't want to conflate that with somebody who is at 200% of the federal poverty level still gets like the maximum benefit is the same as somebody who had a very low income. There's actually sort of a cross effect where as income rises, benefit amount goes down. It better supports income and wage growth. And then when we think about program alignment, this is one of the things that I think Kentucky does do well and still has opportunity in is to think about better coordination between, workforce development partners and KCTCS, ensuring that post-secondary credential and attainment is a priority for DCBS. And this was in the stack previously prior to having the conversation with DCBS yesterday. That feels very clear to me that this is a priority for DCBS. So it's just finding ways to bridge the disconnect between how higher education systems think about and assess need and the way that human services programs and systems think about and assess need, and finding those intersection points to strengthen the connections that benefit both recipients in being able to achieve their post-secondary credentials. I do know you had some cross-agency working groups, but thinking about, getting everybody in the room at these intersection touch points between DCBS and the 2 years and the 4 years and the public and the privates and, the workforce development agencies to identify where do we see the connective threads here and how can we better support and align on all sides, not just that benefit the institutions, but that also help the agencies and workforce development boards achieve their goals and objectives. And finally, these are the expanded opportunities that I was talking about. Some states have accomplished these things through state legislation. That is certainly an opportunity. And one thing that I would say is it can be an opportunity in states where even where you have a really supportive agency, you don't necessarily have a supportive legislature and your agency needs some cover or support to be able to accomplish the things they need. So thinking about the different strategies and how they're supportive of the overall goals of the state is important in considering how we might tackle some of these expanded opportunities. So for example, in California and Massachusetts, they leverage their state TANF or in your state KTAP dollars to fund a need-based grant aid program. It's called Cal Grant in California and Mass Grant in Massachusetts. And the benefit of this is that it also, a student, even if they are not receiving state KTAP dollars in this instance, but they are receiving that need-based grant aid, it also confers SNAP eligibility due to a policy called categorical eligibility. So there's a lot of sort of circular benefit in thinking about a strategy like that. And then in the state of Maine, they have it's currently a small scale program, but they have a program to fund campus navigators on each campus for certain students with need. And that was actually accomplished through state legislation, which I supported them in working on. States also have an opportunity to establish a state-funded work-study program. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the federal work-study program, but it is a safe-to-say flawed model that overwhelmingly benefits private four-year institutions. So the funding allocation is based on a prior year allocation. So institutions that have been were established earlier and have been around longer get larger federal work-study allotments, which means that even a student who attends that institution, who they often tend to be very expensive institutions in terms of cost of attendance, could still qualify for federal work-study because they technically have unmet need. But a student at a private four-year institution is more likely to get federal work-study than a low-income student at a two-year institution or a public four-year institution because of this outdated funding allocation model. So one of the things that Kentucky could think about was establishing a state-funded work-study program, which has a lot of benefits. I think it would maximize your ready-to-work program, which leverages work-study, as well as conferring SNAP eligibility for certain students. One of the other things we think about on the higher education side is award displacement. And for those of you that are not familiar with award displacement, this is when a student gets a financial aid package and then at the end they happen to get a grant or a scholarship that they do not have to pay back. But what actually ends up happening is their federal loans are reduced by that amount because their financial aid package is based on their cost of attendance. So states have the option, and frankly, institutions have the option as well, to apply dollars that do not have to be paid back first. So students, other grants or loans are not reduced. It's called award displacement. And I know that we sit with this tension of being concerned about students over borrowing, but at the end of the day, students should have the ability to decide what of their loans and grants they would like to have applied and not have that decision taken away from them. They should be trusted to know what best supports their academic success. And similarly, professional judgment for your non-higher ed professionals on the phone, professional judgment is a process that is established by the Department of Education that requires certain aspects of financial award determinations to go through. It's almost like an audit process. And there is some discretion in professional judgment for institutions to apply a more in the field, we're sort of thinking about as a more compliance-driven focus as opposed to a student advocacy-driven focus. And some institutions do this in excess of federal requirements. So there is the ability to set policies that say that institutions should not be permitted to enact harsher professional judgment policies than is federally required, which is beneficial for students. One of the things that is actually a professional judgment process is that students with dependents can apply to have their dependent care costs included in their cost of attendance, which would ultimately give them a larger financial aid package to better support their post-secondary attendance. This is also a cumbersome process where it's not actually federally required, but students have to kind of submit to an audit and have their dependent care costs included in their cost of attendance. And all of these additional administrative burdens we know disproportionately harm students who are already facing scarcity and who are already facing basic needs and security. And one of the other things Kentucky could consider is developing housing pilots to support students facing housing issues. There's a couple of really cool examples out there. The state of Massachusetts, obviously in areas where it makes sense and there are institutions in proximity to one another, partner with four-year institutions to provide access to students at community colleges who are homeless or housing insecure beds in dorm rooms. So there are a couple of really interesting things out there with that just being one example. I think I'm doing okay on time, Lily, so I'm just going to pause here for a moment. I always talk really fast, but I was also cognizant that we have a packed agenda. So if there are any reactions or suggestions for additional alignment of policies, programs, or partnerships, happy to raise a couple of those questions now. We'll leave it to Lily on how much time we have for that and can certainly carry this discussion over into breakout rooms. And obviously, Commissioner Dennis and your team, please do feel free to add on to any of this and clarify anything that I may have inadvertently mischaracterized. I've either stunned you all into silence or I covered that really well. I could go either way. Lily, I'm going to hand it back over to you to decide how to go from here. I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Thanks, Carrie. Well, everybody, we will definitely have time in our our breakout groups to kind of discuss and maybe just let it soak in just a little bit more. I'm not a policy wonk, and so that is a lot of information to take in. But I did notice some really great ideas, and so would love to get everybody's reactions when we get into the breakout rooms. I am going to take this opportunity to pass it on. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Carrie, so much. To pass it on to our next kind of element of this project that we're going to get an update on, and that is from our faculty researchers who have been doing all sorts of great work. And we have nine institutions in Kentucky that they are working with, and I'm sure that our faculty will kind of give a little bit of an overview, but I'm going to turn it over to you, Jake Zitzi and Stephanie. Let me see if I can spotlight for everybody, and just let me know when you'd like me to advance.
Thank you, Lily. While the slides are coming up. So yeah, so I'm part of the research trifecta, the research team from University of Louisville. My name is Jake Gross. Zitzi, University of Kentucky. Stephanie is Eastern Kentucky University, and we have been working since September for a little while now on trying to dig into what the 9 partner institutions do to support student basic needs. So Lily, can you go to the next slide, please? So we're going to talk about sort of 2 different pieces of this. And I'm going to take the first part here, which is where we have gone in and really to provide a baseline and context for focus groups and interviews on the ground at these partner institutions. A research team of 5 students and I hand searched every website for, well, the 9 institutions, but then we thought it would be helpful to, as context, to also look at all the other institutions in Kentucky. So what I'm going to talk about, I'll start broad and talk about that broader context of institutions and then narrow it down to what we found at the 9 institutions. So again, this is really just to provide a sense of what we can find on the websites and also give us some comparative information in terms of what other institutions have listed on their websites. Could you go to the next slide, Lily? So just really briefly, because if the only thing that's better than a 9 or 8 o'clock or 6 o'clock meeting is when someone hits you with data and a bunch of tables right away, right? But just briefly to tell you what we did here, we selected all nonprofits, so we're not including for-profit institutions in Kentucky, Title IV eligible institutions. So we ended up with 49. Now, one of those was a special mission institution at the graduate level. So what I'm about to talk about does not include that institution. So we have 48 institutions. We developed a protocol based on the research literature in terms of defining what basic needs are, much of what we've talked about here, but housing, food and security, childcare, mental health, medical health, and a few other things. And then went in, developed a protocol with search terms and a systematic process to hand search all these websites. Piloted that protocol, revised it, then the research team went in and searched every website once, a different researcher searched it a second time, and then we did a random sample of 10 institutions to search it a third time. So I do want to note though, as I talk here, and Stephanie and Zitzi will get more into this, is that this is what we found on the websites. Okay, so that's not necessarily saying that this is what institutions are doing. We're not even, with this first part of the study, aren't even really sort of getting at whether students are using these services. So we know university websites can be out of date. If you go and look at my own institutional profile, you'll see my profile shot that I still have black hair. It's not all gray anymore. So can you do the next slide, please? Okay, so again, so we're going to sort of start broadly here, just the context of these 48 institutions. We're all familiar with, I think we're all pretty familiar with higher education in Kentucky, so I'll be brief on this, but we have a pretty even split between public and private institutions. Most of the post-secondary institutions in Kentucky are 4 years or above. The majority are sort of these, I would say, medium, small size, between 1,000 and just under 5,000 institutions. And the Kentucky overall post-secondary education is not highly selective. So if you look at the percent admitted there, 74%, of course, that is excluding the community colleges. A high proportion of our students receive financial aid of any sort. And then, of course, given the economic needs in the state, perhaps not surprising that 51% of the students received Pell Grants as an indicator of sort of economic need. I should note all of these data points come from 2021, which is the most available or the most recently available data. So that's, again, that's sort of the 48 institutions. That's the broader context. Could you do the next slide, Lily, please? Okay, so just digging in a little bit more to the institutional characteristics of the partner institutions. On this slide, you see some institutional characteristics across the top there, and then the institutions listed in rows there are the 9 partner institutions. We pulled in some 2021 data from the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, just again, to get a sense of the context, the institutional characteristics here. You'll see that in terms of the partner institutions, there's some variability. The number of services that we found, again, on the website range from 5 to 9. Overall, these institutions are not highly selective, have relatively low admission yields. The overwhelming majority of the students receive financial aid. You can see the retention rates vary here with a low of 56% at JCTC to a high of 86% at University of Kentucky. That's full-time, first-time students. And again, there's a fair bit of range here in terms of the percent of students receiving Pell Grants. And not surprisingly, we see that our Pell Grant students overall have lower graduation rates compared to non-Pell Grant recipients. So again, these are some of the characteristics of the 9 partner institutions. Next slide, please. Now, when we compare the partner institutions to those that were not a partner institution, so again, it's the 9 compared to the 40 institutions here. we see that, perhaps not surprisingly, this is, if we look at the number of student basic needs services we found at the partner institution websites, that number at the top there, this is a self-selected group. So overall, those institutions that partnered with CPE on this initiative have more services listed on their websites than non-partner institutions. But if we go down through the rows here and compare the characteristics of the institutions that partnered and did not partner, there aren't a lot of other differences, at least based on these characteristics. I think with the exception of that, among the partner institution group, we see that the community colleges are overrepresented relative to their numbers in the state. And I think that was obviously an intentional, I think that was intentional on the part of CPE and the team there. So next slide, please, Lily. Okay. So what did we find at these institutions? This, and I apologize that it's kind of small, it's the big table here, shows by institution. So the institutions are in the rows, the columns represent the different forms of services that we found at these institutions on their websites. We see a variety of services were listed, the most common being mental health, which has become, if you've been in higher ed long enough, you remember when that wasn't a standard service that was provided to institutions. That's pretty standard now. And of course, under campus employment, that's work study. All institutions, we had information on the websites related to those. The next most common form of service we found on the websites would be the food pantries, medical health, emergency aid, and childcare. Now, again, just it's important to note, we're not necessarily saying that these services are being used by students or that they are broadly accessed. So the least common form of service that we found were emergency housing, a food stipend, and public transportation voucher. Now, when we look at these institutions and try to discern some patterns of who's offering what and maybe why, at least at initial glance, we can't find a real discernible pattern here. So for example, it's not necessarily that institutions that are located in more urban areas will more likely have public transportation vouchers. In fact, we see some of our institutions that are in the most urban areas here did not have public transportation vouchers listed on their website. One of the other things we were sort of interested in is what institutions partner with community agencies or groups. So that's the COM partner column there. You can see that over 2/3 or just about 2/3 of the institutions partner with community agencies to help provide services to their students. And then the other thing we were interested in is there a central point of contact where a student can go and say, hey, I need help with X or Y or Z, who do I talk to? And only University of Kentucky could we find a point of contact for that. So if you could move to the next slide, please. I'll wrap up here. So we were, as I said in the prior slide, we were interested in discerning if there was any kind of pattern here about why institutions have some services and not others. And again, this is a really high level look here. So we took the IPEDS data that we had merged in with the data we collected from the campus websites. And we wanted to do some really exploratory kind of analysis of, are there certain characteristics, certain aspects of institutions here that pop in terms of statistical relationship between, in this case, the number of services and that characteristic, right? So we ran a basic regression model here. The items that listed there, the variables listed in the rows there are what we were sort of using to predict the number of services at an institution. And I'm just going to talk about 3 things here really briefly. So if you look at the very top there, partner institution, that means an institution that was part of this collaborative. If you go over to the unstandardized coefficients, 2 would represent the number of services. So what this tells us is that a partner institution was statistically more likely to have more services. Again, not surprising, but it confirms what we saw earlier in some of the descriptive data in terms of the partner institutions being a self-selected group with respect to their interest in the collaborative and providing basic needs, or saying they're providing basic needs towards the students. The only other characteristics that really seem to have a statistical relationship and a practical significance here with the number of services provided was whether it was a private institution. So you can see the coefficient there is a negative, which means private institutions had fewer numbers of services listed on their website compared to public institutions. And then perhaps not surprisingly, we found something similar for our community or our 2-year institutions. So on average, compared to a 4-year institution, a community college had almost 3 fewer services listed on their website. Other than that, we didn't find any, for example, we didn't find any meaningful relationship. We were interested in like institutional wealth and endowment and how much the institutions spent on student services or academic support. We didn't find any statistical relationship there between the number of services provided and those factors. So again, very exploratory, very initial, but that's what we found from the website search and using some of the institutional characteristics. I will have time for questions at the end, and I will turn it over now to Zitzi.
Stephanie, do you want to get us started?
Yeah. So the next step after we did the website scan, the next step what we did was interview the administrators who had been designated as point of contacts at each of the universities. And so we had a standard protocol that we used with each one of them. They were generally in groups of, I would say 3 to 5. We had one case where there was one person, but and then I think the highest case we had 5. But the goal of the administrator interviews was to document what the website said compared to what the administrators saw on campus, and kind of dig a little deeper into the information that was just openly available on the website. Lily, if you can go to the next one. So each interview was a Zoom interview. It was about an hour long, and it included, again, those administrators on the partner campuses. During the interview, what we did was we told the administrators what we had found on the website, and then we asked them to kind of talk more about that with us. We also asked them about how the resources on their campus were used. What were the things that they did to draw students to those, to alert students to what was available on campus, and then what kinds of students tended to use resources, what resources were actually used. And then finally, we asked them to kind of talk about the impact of the pandemic and how that addressed student need and then also campus practices. And there was a lot of really interesting information that came out of there, and Zitzi's going to cover that with us.
Okay, so our respondents, just to give you a sense of whom we spoke to, as Jake mentioned, they represented individuals from all of the 9 partner campuses. And notably, the people we spoke to play a variety of roles on their campuses, whether it's in student affairs and institutional research and DEI related positions, among others. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the positions of people on their campuses and the work that they do there. And largely our sample, not entirely, but largely we interviewed women or people who identified as women and those who identified as either white or Caucasian. Next slide, please. Okay, I can't emphasize enough that these are early results. We're still combing through the data. And as was implicit in what Stephanie said, we're really going to focus today on the first part of the interviews that we conducted with administrators, which is the sort of checking and balancing of what the administrators are saying about services that are on the website of different campuses. So we're trying to really triangulate here between what Jake and his team found and then what campus administrators were saying to us when we spoke to them. And we have today to talk to you about 3 main thematic findings. And again, an emphasis on the initial part of these findings. So this has come up a little bit in the chat already, but one thing that comes through from our interview data is that the information that's available online is sometimes somewhat inconsistent inconsistent with the services that are available to students on the ground. And I'll talk more about this in just a second. The second main finding is that the resources and services that campus staff are able to provide are related to the ecosystem of supports more broadly in which they exist. I don't think this will be a surprise to anyone on the call here, and Jake has already alluded to this. And so that's something that came up and comes through when we look at the administrator interview data. And then the last part, and I was really struck by Carrie's presentation and recommendations as I was listening to her and thinking about this finding, is we'll share a little bit today about the ways in which we found out that campuses are innovating with services and resources. And it's important to note that not all of these get represented or captured online when we do an online search. So next slide, please. So let's take each of these findings in turn. So our first finding, as a reminder, was that the information that's available online is sometimes inconsistent with students' services that students actually have access to. And we find that this sort of operates in two directions. So on one hand, we find that there are more or richer services that are accessible to students than what is represented online. So often online, we see evidence that there are food pantries that are available for students to use. And what was really striking to us as we're starting to look through the interview data is that these food pantries provide far more than fresh and non-perishable food items. So often they provide home goods, personal hygiene items, clothing, among other sort of tangible goods, as well as oftentimes food pantries are a location, a hub of service provision on campuses. And so describing them or understanding them just as food pantries, as one might be want to do from just looking online, doesn't quite capture the richness, the depth of the services that are actually provided in these locations on the ground. And then we also found evidence of sort of the inverse, right? So in some cases, when I'm struck by the fact, when you think back to the big table that Jake helped us look through, that childcare was the most common service provided across campuses. And there's a lot of inconsistency there in terms of the actual service provision. We're highlighting childcare because that came up a number of times as not actually a service that was provided on campuses by campuses, but really it was linking students to services that were provided in their communities. And it wasn't a service that was actually offered on campus. So taken together, we're starting to see that there are some differences in terms of what we see online relative to what the experience of actually having access to these services is like.
Another thing in this part that was interesting is the awareness of the administrators about what was on their website. In some cases, they were very aware of what was on there and what was and the way that it was laid out. And in other cases, I can think with my own institution, at one point I said, and the website says, and they were like, wait, where does it say that? What does that say? And so that was also very interesting about kind of looking at the different ways that the administrators had interacted with the websites.
Next slide, please. So our second finding, as a reminder, was that resources and services that campus staff are able to provide, or campuses are able to provide, appear to be related to the ecosystem of supports in which they exist. And so there are some state level and federal level supports that are sort of unrelated to what we're talking about here. We were struck by two features. One is partnerships with local community organizations, as well as both the urban location of a campus, as well as the largeness of an institution. Those seem to be factors that are important. So what we mean by this is, even though in the online web search, for instance, Jake mentioned that you don't see transportation showing up. A number of the urban campuses are able to offer, for instance, transportation alternatives for students in order to get to and from campus for at either reduced or free rates. They're able to partner with community-based organizations, as well as larger institutions are able to better or able to leverage resources within the campus itself. So from different parts of campuses. And this is again relates to urbanicity, where smaller campuses in urban areas can partner with larger campuses. So Carrie mentioned that, I'm sorry, Carrie, I'm already forgetting, maybe it was in Massachusetts, that there are community colleges that are partnering with four-year colleges to come up with some housing alternatives for students. And we have some evidence of that in our data as well, right here in Kentucky. Okay.
Another thing that
Yeah.
came out of this kind of, came out of that was the ways that the campuses interact with their community resources. So one of our community colleges was talking about how they use a community action, their community action coalition, to kind of find out what is available, and then linking into anything that they hear about.
Lovely. Thank you. And then our last and final finding we'll talk about today is the extent to which campuses are innovating with services. And to Jake's point about how responsive campus websites are to this innovation, I think there's definitely a lag there. And something to keep in mind too is that campuses we have some evidence that campuses are trying different resources, different ways of providing services, are finding that they don't work. And so that sort of gets a little bit lost, right? It doesn't end up on a website necessarily, but it is something that a campus tried. And so this was particularly striking to us in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, although we suspect that there was innovation prior to the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And there are really, initiatives are shifting. They've shifted multiple times in terms of emergency aid around amounts and guidelines for students, especially in light of the pandemic modality of services. In particular, moving between in-person and hybrid options, whether it's around providing services, or say medical or mental health, food options, and then as well as thinking more broadly about housing and how access to technology folds into access to housing and the tools students need in order to be successful academically. Stephanie, anything to add there?
Just I would say about the modality, most of the campuses, particularly community college campuses that we talked to, said that their access to mental health services was online. It was a 24/7 crisis line or information that students could get. And then if they needed in-person services, they were linked out to the community. So there was a lot of difference in the understanding of how online could be used that we didn't think about before the pandemic and then recognized afterwards.
Great. Yeah, and we're looking forward to questions, comments, thoughts, feedback. Lily, we'll pass it back to you, I think.
Zitzi, do you want to talk about real quick just about our next steps?
Sure. Yeah, so some of you might already know on this call, our next step is to do some focus groups with students. And so we'll be doing focus groups at all 9 partner institutions. These are officially underway as of yesterday. And the focus groups will be with 2 groups of students, those who have reported using some of these services, as well as students who don't. And we're happy to chat more about those as well.
Thank you all so much. I know we're going to have some more time in our breakout rooms to kind of discuss our thoughts and kind of reactions or responses, or how we think we could use this information to improve our either our own personal offerings or to partner more to enhance offerings for students. I will say that I do plan to share the website asset mapping document. Jake, that's right, correct? And that will have web links, like hot links to all of these resources. And kind of the idea is now some of them are not going to be as robust as the actual services available on those campuses. So we're, you know, in light of these findings, you know, thinking about what we can glean from website asset mapping, but it is a good place to start. And if we do see, like from a personal perspective, oh, I'm really interested in knowing what other campuses are doing around transportation or childcare, you know, this is at least a really good document to be able to review and get a pretty comprehensive picture of what it looks like, at least from the student perspective here in Kentucky. And I do think that the recommendations from this research project are going to be really valuable to all of our 48 institutions across the state for looking for those opportunities, and maybe even some lower hanging fruit opportunities to increase awareness of services that are available, and then hopefully, you know, just get more students to be able to access them. Thank you guys so much. Does anybody have a quick question in the large group? We're doing awesome on time.
Phil, in answer to your question, Phil asked about how college staff are linking students to resources. That's one of the things that we heard, I think at quite a number of the colleges, how that was part of their student services, right? Is they looked to find opportunities for students. And I know in one of my interviews, they talked a lot about vocational rehabilitation and about really linking students into voc rehab, but also helping them sign up for KTAP or TANF, and looking for other resources that way. Childcare assistance, help with finding childcare assistance as well.
Okay, I know we're going to go to the breakout rooms. There will be a facilitator in each breakout room, and they have some kind of guiding questions, but you know, we'll be taking notes, and all of these notes that we're gathering in this phase of the Action Network are going to come back. We'll be able to bring them back when we do meet in person for a much longer period of time, where we'll be really able to kind of discuss deeply what all of these great ideas are that are rising to the surface. And I see a question from Ariane is anyone following up on whether students are following through with referrals? So like a referral to a nonprofit organization or a benefits agency. Do you want to come up, Ariane? And so what is the process for being able to follow up?
So yeah, if they're following up, and if there's a process of how they're following up, and then kind of if they're gathering like information on why students aren't following up, because I've been trying to figure out how to do that, you know, more efficiently, to see, you know, if there's actually a gap in services or a hurdle that's keeping the students from getting to the resource that I'm referring them to.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. We are not doing that. Maybe that'll come out more in the focus group interviews. So we can see what students say about that, but that is a really good question. The you know, referrals are only as good as follow through, right?
Yeah, I'll add to sort of just detail what Stephanie said. So we're not going to be able to individually follow students. So, you know, a student gets a referral, like what happens to them subsequently. But to Stephanie's point, this is a question on our focus group protocol. It's about accessing services more broadly rather than specific to referrals. But I'm hoping, and I guess I'm assuming, there are some themes that will come through there that will hopefully be useful to your practice.
And Ariane, that's just a great, I guess, gap to identify. You know, we can refer, and how do we know? Is there that relationship with the receiving organization that helps us get a feedback loop on, you know, the particular student that we might be trying to help? So I love that. Please share that in the breakout room. Nan, are we ready to go? Do you want to pause the recording and send us off?
Sure.
Thank you.
I think the idea that kept cropping up in our conversation was around, wouldn't it be wonderful if perhaps the state could fund campus-based connectors, public assistance connectors, navigators, whatever you want to call them, so that there was a well-informed go-to person on college campuses. And I shared that we have that to a limited extent through our TANF-funded Ready to Work coordinators, but unfortunately their services are very limited to the ever shrinking TANF KTAP population in our state. But it would be wonderful to have that kind of point person on campuses.
Thank you, Shauna. Let's see, maybe Phyllis, do you want to go next?
Yes, okay, we had some healthy discussion going on. Thank you, everybody who was in my space. I love the comment about making sure that students understand what we're talking about. We know that they are the end user, so they need to be able to define and understand so that then they can go to the next step, you know, be that trying to secure assistance or, you know, making a quick decision about something. So the information and the content that we put out there needs to be easily understood by our students. There were also some ideas around making sure that we clarify what is a community resource versus an on-campus resource, you know, and just being really descriptive in terms of what that is. And then there might need to be even more definitions with regard to what those things are. Again, it's about the student understanding what things are as quickly as possible so that they can move in the direction in which they need to. I love the comment that someone shared in our group about making sure that the right people are at the table. Not, you know, we're talking in some cases about financial aid, but are those folks at the table? Are they able to be there for the buy-in or to take what's necessary back to the people who can make these decisions? So a lot of good things came out. I will continue to script all of this out and put it on the document for your final review.
Thanks, Phyllis.
And team, please add anything in the chat if there is something else that you want to bring to light for the group.
I can share a couple of things from our team that sort of piggyback off of what Phyllis said. Is we did talk about the importance of making sure that language is accessible and inclusive and asset-based. So, you know, sharing things when we're talking about access to SNAP or needing food assistance, like, are you having trouble affording groceries this month? Did you skip a meal? As opposed to saying, you know, are you food insecure? Which certainly in this space, you know, we broadly understand that, but it's common both, I think, in higher ed and in, you know, state agencies where we get stuck in our lane of language and forget to sort of humanize it and make it accessible, as well as, you know, thinking about the trauma-informed approach that, you know, facing financial hardship is traumatic, and there are a host of, you know, additionally difficult traumatic experiences that students come to our institutions with. And then the importance of Victoria at EdTrust made a really good point about there's this tension between making sure services are visible and accessible, but also recognizing that that could be a deterrent for some people who would rather maintain some privacy when they're accessing services, and how to sort of strike the balance between those tensions. Was there anything else from our, childcare? Really the discussion about accessing childcare, and I think there are some things we can think about there, both improving potential policy solutions for improving the availability of childcare, and then discussions around access to childcare resources. If there's anything that my group discussed that I missed that you felt strongly about, please feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Carrie and Carrie's group. Travis, do you have any high takeaways?
Yeah, we had a great discussion from the campus standpoint. You know, we really focused on, not from the campus standpoint, but from the state and policy standpoint, really focused on kind of how do we get rid of work requirements and really make it pathways. So it's not just, you know, you meet a certain requirement, but how do we put you on the pathway to be successful for long term, and put you in something that the state needs, and also, you know, you can be fulfilled from a work standpoint. So it doesn't feel like a burden. And then from the campus standpoint, really focused on what that, Jake brought up a great point that he feels that every institution should have some point person or some point unit or someone responsible for student basic need. And, how do we kind of put that into a process or maybe a best practice, for institutions across the state. And then we really focused on the intersection. We kind of got the inventory of what the state provides, got an inventory of what the campuses provide, but what does that intersection look like? How do we go about, do we need representatives from the state on campus? How do we create best processes around that, or best practices around that, to see kind of what that looks like in practice, so that we can utilize what's offered at the state and at the campus and kind of create a synergy between the two.
Thank you, Travis. Is my group the last group? I think we might be. Shauna just added, additional thought from the group included improved screening for basic needs when students access financial aid or other services on campus. Interested in what data looks like for students of color. CAAs have resources to support students. What's a CAA?
Community action agencies.
Got it. Okay.
I think that some of our rural community colleges are really leveraging those community action agencies better than some of the more urban areas.
Thank you. Yeah, that was definitely one of the thoughts that came up in our group, is how do we identify students early so we can support them before crises arise. And also there's a lot of decision-making points in their early time that can, there are maybe better decisions or, more financially responsible decisions, and then there are other decisions. And so we want to help those students and be there as a support for them as they're making these really important decisions around housing costs and all of those things. We talked about leveraging our partnerships, specifically between KCTCS and DCBS, to hopefully look at that data and look at our student enrollment and being able to maybe proactively identify and support students that way. We definitely talked about childcare, and even if we aren't able to grow that pot of CCAP funding, we still have another issue of just childcare deserts and lack of availability of affordable childcare. And so, especially when we know adult students or students with children are going to be on our campuses, what can our campuses do to maybe provide an evening childcare opportunity that may not look like a formal full-time 5 days a week daycare center, but still can help our parenting students to meet those needs. Okay, those were just some of the takeaways. I just have 2 minutes, so let me share. I want to tell you all about the next meeting. I am so excited about it. We are going to be meeting in person on April 5th. It is a long window of time, but I just want you to know, we need a 5-hour meeting in order to provide lunch. And so we have a 5-hour meeting. I want to provide you all lunch. We will also be reimbursing mileage for anyone who is traveling in and would like to request that. Nan, if you wouldn't mind putting the RSVP link in the chat, that would be great. We would love to be able to prepare for who is attending, how many folks can join us. The agenda is going to be highly focused on, let me just go to the next slide, kind of continuing to move around this process wheel for our action network. So you're going to get all these slides. You can read it a little bit more if you're interested, but basically we're in this lovely teal green circle at the bottom, matching my outfit. And we have been really understanding our current state picture. Where are we? Wrapping our arms around our students and our campus resources and our community policies and all of these things. And now when we get in person for a nice bit of time, we're going to be talking about what is that future state picture that we are working for? What is our vision? And then what do we think are going to be those most high impact catalytic projects, processes, policy recommendations, et cetera, that will help us get to our vision. And then, of course, from there, that's going to basically be, we're going to end up in this light green spot when we wrap up our action network. And then we'll move into really mapping this out on a timeline with partnership responsibilities, with implementation you know, expectations or goals, and seeking funding. I want to say that a million times so that we know that this is worth it. Let's put the time in. Let's come up with an amazing plan that is realistic for our state and for our partnership that we are all like super on board with. And then I think that we'll be really successful as we move forward into implementation. So I hope that you can all join us for this next meeting. There are going to be some other opportunities to just talk basic needs. We are hosting 2 community of practice virtual conversations coming up. They are kind of, they've spun out of the Student Success Summit. And so the work that we did there with a variety of campus partners, many of folks who are not a part of this Action Network, but I really do hope, you know, you're welcome to join us. The links to these meetings will be in my follow-up email, which will come out sometime between Friday and Monday. So that is all that I have. And I really appreciate all of you and looking forward to seeing your beautiful faces April 5th. And I'll send out a much more detailed agenda so you can get a sense of like, this is our 30-minute breakfast networking window, and this is our 30-minute wrap-up conversation. So, you know, hopefully the travel time won't be as compressed as it might look with a 9:30 start, but Eastern time. But just, you know, really hope that you can join us. And there are 3 in-person meetings. So just reach out to me if you have questions. Come early, come April 5th, come April 26th. If you can't make it in May, I'm sure that's going to be the one where we're mostly reviewing, and you'll have an opportunity to see any document that we're preparing well in advance of that actual conversation. So please be with us this coming April 5th. All right, everyone, have a lovely day. Happy St. Patty's. Woo.